Okay. Firstly, I'm from the Australian Urban Design Research Centre. We're a research centre of UWA and we're affiliated with the Department of Planning, none of who should be held accountable for what I say tonight. We're asking you and inviting you to consider a broader context to Fremantle's growth. That context is firstly a national context and secondly a regional context. So, firstly to the national context. The Australian Bureau of Statistics predicts two sets of population statistics for this century. That is that by mid-century, our national population will more or less double, and by the end of the century, it will more or less triple. It should be pointed out, this is the highest projections that the ABS, the Bureau of Statistics, give us, but we feel they should be taken seriously, and that we should work to the highest projections, because we can always backtrack from that point. So basically, the 2,100 figure applies to the whole nation of 62 million people, and the mid-century projection of 42 million, they also break down into projections for the cities. And they project a Perth of about 4.2 million. So we're roughly increasing 2.5 times in the next 40 years. So this means it's taken us 200 years to build what we have. Essentially, we need to build that over again 2.5 times in the next 40 years, which in itself is a formidable challenge. However, we now have to do that within the constraints of diminishing resources. We're going to run out of oil in about 42 years. We're running out of steel. Even uranium is going to be expended in the next 90 years or so. So we have to do this enormous city building exercise in a period where we're going to be quite constrained. We also can't emit carbon as we have in the past, so there's an additional constraint there. It's a formidable challenge. When we look to the existing planning as to how this has been planned for, we must turn to the capital city plans, which exist for all the major cities of Australia. We don't have a federally coordinated plan for this growth. It occurs city by city. And our planning is, at a really simplistic level, mostly defined by our infill targets and our greenfield targets. Infill targets means urban development within the existing growth boundary, and greenfield targets, which refers to development which is outside the existing city, essentially a suburbia. And when we take a quick look around the nation at all the capital city plans, we find they average about 60%. So we're trying to achieve 60% infill development. Perth has a fairly unambitious target of 47%, the lowest in the nation for infill development. So we just thought, just to visualise that kind of growth for you, we would project forward to 2050 to that population of 4.2 million as to what implications that will have for our city if we stick to the existing policy settings of 47% infill development and 53% greenfield. So this is what the government is saying. All we're doing is taking the government figures and running them out to mid-century. And it means this. We will need to build 480 square kilometres of suburban fabric in the next 40 years, which is accurately scaled there on the left. So you can see that hovering over Perth. It's a substantial amount of suburban fabric we will build according to the policy settings. So we need to build 618,000 new suburban houses, and according to the policy, we need to build 576,000 apartments, which will go principally into activity centres, which is densification around transport nodes. So, the real issue is this. I mean, to date, suburban fabric has served us pretty well. But in a context when we're going to run out of oil, we're not going to be able to drive private vehicles around to get to these suburban houses, we have a real issue. We have a greater issue too, which is that Perth sits within a biodiversity hotspot. Even though we look at the vegetation in the Swan Coastal Plain, it doesn't look very biodiverse. It doesn't look like the Amazon. It really just looks like scrubland. But in fact, it's one of a very biodiverse regions in the world. It's what's called a biodiversity hotspot. Biodiversity hotspots are characterised by the fact they have 50% of the world's plant species in them, and they're under serious threat. They've already been cleared to an extent of about 70%. So this additional 480 square kilometres of suburban development will likely be built on the Swan Coastal Plain, and we're yet to be able to reconcile suburban development with this very biodiverse and very fragile landscape. And this is the issue. That's if we do meet our infill targets, but we're not presently. Presently, although across the nation we're trying to achieve 60% infill, we're only really doing about 30% at the moment. So even though we talk about building an additional 480 square kilometres of suburban fabric, if we continue not to meet our infill targets, that's going to be substantially more. And we could consider that Perth could be renamed at Girth, and then we'll be looking at this kind of nightmare scenario where Perth could extend to Lancelin in the north and Mile Up in the south. And as I've said, it's not a very resilient form. When you're going into a century where you're going to be experiencing the effects of climate change and diminishing resources, this is not the kind of suburban form you want to be stuck with. The other issue is that a lot of you will be saying, well, yeah, we don't like that, but geez, the infill development we've seen isn't very good either. And look, I can totally concur with you, and I empathise with that. I empathise with it because this is me standing on the roof of my house in Bayswater. So I'm living in this stuff, and it's not pleasant. Small blocks, big houses, residual space around the house, which really doesn't provide much in terms of amenity. But it also doesn't provide much in terms of ecosystem services. Historically, our gardens, they sequestered carbon, they grew food, they dealt with stormwater, they provided for recreation. And there was a kind of peacefulness that comes about with interaction with nature and vegetation, which you lose in this setting where you're staring out your bedroom window at a fence. So we've tried to give them some names to bring them to life there, but they're typically low amenity. They're unsustainable. The houses are not shrouded by vegetation, which reduces the heating and cooling loads. And they offer little to existing communities. The existing community doesn't benefit from this kind of infill development. And so I could hardly agree with people who feel opposed to this kind of thing. So the question for today is, and I'm not the person to answer this, but we had a quick go, is what could Fremantle's role be in solving this dilemma? And I'm going to nail my colours to the mast here. I do think freo should be and we think Fremantle should be a node of density. And for the following reasons. It has significant cultural amenity. I mean, freo has a great kind of character and it's got a great life about it, it's got a great energy about it. And we feel that that's the kind of thing that we should be building upon. It's got greater natural amenity, so access to the rivers and the coasts. So the idea here is fundamentally, we believe, for doing density well in this century, it's going to be about doing density where we do have amenity. It's not, when you create density where you don't have amenity, you look at creating a ghetto-like situation. You need to build on your strengths when it comes to consolidating cities. It's about connectivity. We have access to great public transport in Fremantle. The idea that we should be putting people where they have access to connectivity, to transport. It's about employment. You want to put people where they can work. And it's got good bones. We can all acknowledge that the structure of Fremantle is very resilient, and it's the kind of structure we feel you can graft density onto. And it has great character, and we don't see that character and heritage and urban infill development and growth are mutually exclusive. We believe if it's handled properly, the act of infilling the city can actually build on the kind of character and the heritage that we have. And I wanted to just make a point that this is not the kind of density we're talking about. Unfortunately, we have a legacy of quite bad high-density development from the 1970s, and it has to be, we have to make a distinction here. This is not the kind of density we're talking about. This offers very little to an existing community, and it actually offers very little to the people living in it too, apart from the fact that it can be affordable. This is more like what we're talking about. This is density as you might experience it in 2013. A couple of projects here from around Australia which are sustainable. It's about putting people where transport is. They're well adapted in terms of the climate, and they're done with efficient building techniques. They're livable. It's about having very high quality upgraded public open space around these developments, which acts as an incentive for a local community to accept them. They're affordable. So it's about having a diversity of people who can afford to live in your neighbourhood. It's also about for you, when you want to age in place and you don't want to have to move out of your neighbourhood, there's options there. So there's a diversity of housing stock. And they're integrated. You don't just plonk these things into the suburbs, they're integrated into suburban fabric. They're built on transport corridors. They're built in a way that they blend into the suburb. They're not just plonked in. So, enough generalities. This argument is fairly well established, I guess, where I've been to so far, but we would like to actually land this in freo and just visualise a scenario of how freo could grow into the future. And I'm going to step back a little bit from this. This was done by a student of ours, an excellent student, Dinesh Candias, who posed the question, first initially posed the statement, and he said, we're not necessarily saying Fremantle Port should go. That's not for us to say. We're not economists. We don't understand the mechanics of ports, and that's hard to predict. However, he did say, but if it did go, what would the site's potential be? And we've had a quick go at visualising it. So this is an image of Fremantle could look like by 2056 from a helicopter floating off the coast. The development of the port in a way that's potentially livable. You have many people potentially living at quite high density here with great access to the beaches, great access to the river, and to the cultural amenity of Fremantle. It's potentially sustainable. They're living near transport. They're living near where there could be wave energy and wind energy. And it could be designed from the ground up around the principles of sustainability. And it could contain about 55,000 dwellings. or about 100,000 people, which could do two things. One, it takes the pressure off other areas of Fremantle to develop at significant density, but even more significantly, it potentially saves about 34 square kilometres of the Swan Coastal Plain heathland that we've talked about, which is often forgotten, which is on the edge of the city, which is part of one of these only 21 biodiversity hotspots in the world. So, the question I would pose to you today is, what is Fremantle's role in accommodating an additional 2.5 million people in the region by 2056, which is what the Australian Bureau of Statistics have projected. It's not something we've dreamt up, in a way that is both sustainable and livable. Thank you.